Let's get straight down to it without wasting any time. So what we're trying to achieve over here is to understand, is the EV sector investment worthy? What kind of opportunities and challenges are faced within the sector, as well as what is expected in the future for the EV market in India. And let's start with the questions straight up. So I'd like to ask Charles the first question. In terms of what kind of investment opportunities does the EV sector pose? And along with, could you touch upon what kind of segments are of prime focus for investors in the near future?
Sure, thanks, Karan. So I think we've heard it through several of the panelists earlier today, but to start off with what we think of when we say electric vehicles. In the West, you think of a Tesla or a Toyota Prius or a four-wheel vehicle, but they have problems of range anxiety, they're expensive, and even though they've been in the US and Europe for many years, you're still at less than 2% of vehicle sales are electric vehicles in those areas. If you go to China, which you'll talk about, you have 23 million electric two-wheelers that are sold, although recently you've seen a decline in sales due to the decrease in subsidies that have come about. But the 23 million two-wheelers is a dramatic difference compared to the rest of the world in electric vehicles. So when we think about areas to look at in electric vehicles, due to the higher cost of a battery, you have a lower cost per kilometer driven than an IC engine. And in order for those financial lines to cross, it has to be a high utilization rate, meaning the vehicle has to be on the road a lot and driven quite a bit. Usually that means, because of the way the charging infrastructure works, or a lack of charging infrastructure, that we're looking at more commercial use cases. So things where the vehicle is on the road for an extended period of time, you get a high utilization rate so that you amortize the cost of the battery very quickly. And we're focused on areas, and then we've seen several businesses that have positive unit economics without taking into regard subsidies or tax benefits. And if you can get positive unit economics, then those are areas that are very interesting to us. Positive unit economics don't really work if you're taking a vehicle and you're commuting to and from work, or you're going to the market because you're only driving in a limited amount of time. But if you're out driving 80 or 100 kilometers a day and you can come back and charge at night, then you're really able to get that higher use case and take advantage of the lower cost per kilometer. So segments that focus on that, which are primarily fleet and commercial, think about ride sharing, logistics, local delivery, and things that are specific to the Indian use case, where you have tight road conditions, so smaller vehicles that need to get in and out quickly, maybe drive submerged in water for a short period of time. Those are unique problems that India faces, and we've seen several companies that are designing products to solve those problems, and it's an interesting area.
Thank you, Charles. So moving on, Nehal, so what do you think are the challenges faced by the EV sector? Any segments that you feel that the investors should actually avoid?
So thanks, Karan. I'll take that question in two parts. So firstly, specific challenges, if I may. I think, let's be realistic. Firstly, the EV infrastructure, and then by that I mean the supply chain. The ICE manufacturers, obviously we've got a very matured cluster units, whether it's all across India. But EV, there is still, I think, way of development ahead. We are scattered, when I say EVs are scattered across India, but there's still formalized clusters to happen. So that's one. A dedicated, mature supply chain that's lacking in the country for now. There are, of course, discussions on the government side, what we're trying to sort of, help get that impetus there, and I think so we'll talk about that shortly. Coming back again, the second challenge, of course, doesn't help that in India, the basic raw materials, whether it's lithium, cobalt, nickel, we don't have those reserves, so we have to rely a lot on imports. The basic components are also at a dear cost, which doesn't make it very commercially viable. That would be, I think, number two in the list. And of course, third, this is a very popular discussion, the whole chicken egg story about whether, whether we start with the charging infrastructure, whether we realize that, there is growing demand, but we need to, I think there China has done exceptionally well, by doing that. So even as per FAME, and I think so we'll talk about that, we are sort of chalking out dedicated money to pump that charging infrastructure. But to cut it short, I think it's a developed or mature supply chain, lack of raw materials availability, and thirdly, the charging infrastructure, which is developing, but it is still miles to go ahead. The second question which you asked, I would say I would tweak that rather than saying that what investors are shying away from EV. In my day-to-day job, we do sort of get a lot of interest, from whether it's from China, whether it's from the EV segment. So I think what they're eyeing towards is they're also doing a wait and watch, how the sort of demand picks up, what the government actually, once we start putting incentives into practice. So there is a lot of development on the two-wheeler side, and I think that's where the real opportunity for the short-term, growth is. As a lot of panelists have been discussing, EV is the way of the future. There is only way to go ahead, is through, petrol and diesel, and then we go to EV. But I think right now, even a lot of startups are focusing, and in our interactions, we do interact with them. So I think two-wheeler is the next buzzword, and I think it's faster adaptability, literally. So that's my 2 point to that.
Thanks, Nehal. Vijay sir, I think, I know some of them that you'll answer later, but for now, in terms of, the government's role, how do you see the government actually trying facilitating private investments in the EV sector? And how do you think private investors or, any investors that are interested in the EV segment can partner with the government?
So basically, the role for public policy or the government is more to enable the emergence of any new industry. Going back in time, you talk about telecom, you talk about any industry which has emerged because of certain conducive policy actions by the government. And that is the role we have to play even now for electric mobility. What would be important for us to see is that while we do that, we also look at the long-term impact in terms of the impact on society as well as the impact on the current industry, which contributes more than 7% to the GDP and employs millions of people. As far as the investments are concerned, we are looking at investments on primarily the supply side. The demand side discussions are a lot, and of course, a lot of work has to be done there, but demand side will be more of a migration from one product to other, or from ICE to the EVs. The investments, when I look at investments, I talk about investments in something new, not a migration, So creation of a new supply base for electric mobility. And when I say electric mobility, I'm talking about vehicles, components, systems, subsystems, and everything. The second is the investments on the charging infrastructure side, because that's a new infrastructure that needs to be created and a huge amount of investments have to be made over there. The third component is the technology development, which somehow we miss out when we talk about investment opportunities, because there you are, of course, for me, investment and employment is an interchangeable term from public policy perspective. So investments are expected on the vehicle and component manufacturing, on the charging infrastructure side, as well as on technology development side. And I would just like to refer to the policy that we are working on right now, which is due for release in the next few months. And this is what we have done, that we have broken the whole policy initiative into 4 components, 2 on the demand side and 2 on the supply side. The EV charging infrastructure we are still keeping on the demand side, but to me it's still a supply side focus area, wherein we are expecting the PSUs and the private players and global EV infra companies and the solar companies to look at this space as a new investment opportunity and create a network of EV infrastructure, which is good enough to give the confidence to individual customers to move towards electric vehicles. On demand side, we are also having a component of demand creation, which, as I said earlier, is more of a migration thing, and I won't call it an investment arena. The other 2 components are on the supply side, wherein we are talking about providing support to any entity which is looking at manufacturing electric vehicles, components, systems, subsystems, and all. And also battery manufacturing. So we should also realize that one big investment opportunity for us is the battery for electric vehicles, both at the pack as well as the cell level. And the charging equipment in manufacturing, that is also an important component. It might not be as big as vehicle and component manufacturing, but still it is an opportunity that we cannot miss out on. There's no point in still looking at a charging equipment that is getting imported from other countries. And then the last component on the supply side is the technology development, where we see companies investing into maybe a captive R&D center, or like an independent R&D center or a center of excellence, and so on and so forth. And there maybe the investment in terms of money terms would not be great, but the employment opportunity there is really high and can be an economic driver as big as the IT sector in totality. We are offering incentives on almost all the aspects of supply side. Charging infrastructure, we are talking about capital subsidy for setting up charging stations. On manufacturing side, we're talking about incentives in terms of interest subsidy, capital subsidy, land price subsidy, power subsidy, so on and so forth. And on the technology development side, we're talking about, again, beyond a certain threshold of investments, we're talking about giving subsidy on taxes, on power subsidy, and land price subsidy, or lease rentals, all those kind of subsidies we are talking about. So to summarize, the policy has to play a key role in supporting the supply base, and the supply base creation on its own without these policy support may not happen because the business case is still not strong enough, looking at the demand and how much investment would go into creating an entity like that to meet the demand. So whatever viability gap is there is what we are trying to look at, provide enough incentives, and also maybe to spur those investments, we are also looking at how we give some kind of assurance to the investors by some government support on procurement as well. Yeah, and we hope that there will be enough demand visibility for the investors to look at. And after the viability gap is addressed through the policy support, good investments are expected in the coming years. And also, we should just look at the median market size. So we are talking about 30 million vehicles getting sold in India, all categories combined. And the Bloomberg graph, which if I refer to, and even if it says flat, less than 2%, 5%. But the 5% of that market size itself is big enough to talk about huge investments and in terms of billions and all. So, but what we also should realize that the investors, the people who are looking at this market should try to establish the base here and not import. Let's not talk about import route. Build the vehicles and the products here and sell for the Indian market. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we'll come back to you on some other questions on import and stuff. But Charles, I think my next question to you actually is taking a cue from what Vijay sir said, and in terms of subsidies and incentives, and from an investment perspective, how does an investor really look at that, and whether these are actually the drivers and drivers for EVs, and can this actually be used for mass adoption?
Right. So when you look at mass adoption of vehicles, there are very few places that have mass adoption, so it's hard to draw a corollary. If you look at mass, how to get mass adoption of electric vehicles in the country, what I would say is we've been focused on areas that have positive unit economics, where vehicles are designed specifically for the environment in India and are designed and built here. Batteries are a different situation. But designed and built for the specific conditions and use cases here. Subsidies are helpful. The tax policy, I think Niti Aayog has been really kind of leading the charge in helping develop at least a policy, a framework, without really, the market hasn't really developed, so they're really out there trying to help it. But from our standpoint, where you really see the biggest problem with automotive, with vehicle manufacturing, is from a seed stage investor standpoint. There have been a couple of large investments, all electric, Aether Energy, and then we see a handful of seed investments, but there's not really much in between that cycle. And what it takes for a small vehicle manufacturer, even a large vehicle manufacturer, to grow and scale is the ability to find debt financing and leasing of vehicles. And it's a new space to banks, and they don't really understand the product. But it's almost impossible to have a financial return by financing electric vehicles through equity. You can't amortize your equity investment. You have to get that back. Whereas if you had debt financing, that would really help spur the growth. I think if you look at Yulu Bikes in Bangalore, or Gayam Motorworks in Hyderabad, or Euler Motors here in Delhi, I think any of those small companies have developed products specifically for the market. And if you'd ask them what the biggest problem they're facing, I think they would say debt financing for their vehicles, because they have orders to grow, but they don't have the backbone and the financial support that exists for internal combustion engines. If they had an order for 1,000 Tata Ace vehicles for a logistics provider, for example, you'd be able to readily find financing for that. But if you have an order for 1,000 vehicles from an electric manufacturer, it's difficult to find the debt financing, and it has to be currently coming through equity, and that becomes a very difficult way to grow. So I think that's the real next step. The subsidies help on the on the consumer push side, but really that's not a logistics fleet business to business type of demand generation tool.
Thank you. So, moving on to Nehal, what really is, in your view, are the infrastructure needs for facilitating mass adoption of EVs?
I think it's sort of what I answered, Karan, in the first part as well. Not going in repetition, but I think I'll take you from what Charles was saying. Even in our interactions, and for everybody's benefit, Invest India is an investment promotion agency, so it's our day-to-day job to keep interacting with sort of global investor community. There is anxiety about traditional finance not being so present in this field. Like I said, banks and financial institutions, they are shying away, or they're sort of doing a wait and watch, let the sort of demand pick up, let it get more matured. So yes, financing is a big gap. I know it's not directly for infrastructure, but it is sort of hampering the entire growth. There are chances that FAME will come out and is already chalked out money for the charging infrastructure. So I would encourage people to sort of divert their attention on that front. Two-wheeler, like I did speak about, that the way it doesn't require that sophisticated infrastructure. It is. I don't know if Gil Saab did mention that it gets charged in a normal electric plug, which is available at every sort of mom and pop store. So that sort of it doesn't. Everybody who's driving a two-wheeler is not looking at 100, 150 kilometer range. So I mean that range anxiety also sort of caters in. But I think the bigger gap is that from where I see right now, there is more focus on sort of battery assembly here. So we are looking at the investor community looks at India that okay there is good optimization of resources and costs. So why don't we set up shop here and import and just assemble packs? I think there is finally good news that there are certain players, it's all available in print media, that they would be setting up manufacturing units in Gujarat and actually start producing or manufacturing lithium-ion batteries. So I think that is a big win, from an India perspective. But I think just to sort of, in the interest of time, I will sum it that finance, charging, and thirdly, lack of actual R&D and actual employee base. That is really required. Let's be fair. If somebody is pumping money into our country, while it does, that's part of my job. It does create jobs. It does create help the GDP cost. But the investor is always looking at a return. So till the time we actually have R&D here, we have actual employees who can be beneficial, to such guys. I think that's the main gap, so to speak.
Sure. Vijay sir, again, I understand you spoke about government being an enabler, and from that angle, I understand that there's a huge support that the government wants to give to the EV ecosystem. How do you think that these challenges that the two investors have mentioned, how do you think the government can actually overcome these to kind of facilitate again investments and grow this entire ecosystem?
So I think one can quickly see a gap in the FAME 2 policy itself, or FAME 2 scheme itself, how and why we missed the opportunity of spurring investment. So if you look at the FAME 2 outlay of 10,000 CR, there's no money for R&D support. Yeah, there is no money for setting up center of excellences. There is no money for supporting the startups. Yeah? But there is all the money for incentivizing buses, cars, two-wheelers, and even awareness programs. This is, I think, a clear message that, if you only give demand support, you will very well be opening the market for imported products to be sold here and availing those incentives. What I would like to see is, and I of course, can refer to an example. I'm not talking in thin air. So if you look at the UK program for EV adoption, almost 25% of the overall outlay, which is similar to what we have, 1 billion GBPs, I believe. Almost 25% of the amount is dedicated for investments in R&D and support for R&D. So if there is a FAME subsidy component or incentive component, I would call it, not subsidy component, or either ways, which supports R&D in India. And the R&D support can go to the small players, even to the big players, because the big players also are not really, sitting in a very, very comfortable zone with the given market scenario. they're also struggling to, kind of make good businesses from their investments that they have made. Most of these units are also having their capacities underutilized. So to ask them to invest in products from scratch without any support will be too much to ask for. Yeah? So government has to support these companies to invest in products which are meant for Indian market. This will first of all eventually go towards manufacturing, not assembly, attract investments, and also maybe give good competition to the imports that we are seeing right now. So the FAME subsidy scheme itself highlights a gap which we need to address. Of course, states at their level are trying to do a lot to support the investments in manufacturing, but there are certain areas where center needs to do a lot more than what has been done in the FAME subsidy.
Thank you, sir. Nehal, I'd like if you could, help for everybody to understand and give a bird's eye view of the current situation of the EV market or the EV situation in India, so that we actually know where we stand today.
Sure. So Karan, I think I was gonna, there was another question, I think in the last round that they said that, the average Indian, the normal person is not aware what exactly is happening. It's quite humbling that the investor community, on the other hand, is keeping, and I'm not only talking about the Chinese investments. I mean, I'm talking about Korea, Taiwan, Japanese. All of them are keeping a very sort of a microscopic lens what exactly Niti Aayog was going to come out. Some of you would be aware they're going to be coming out with a PMP program, which is for cell manufacturing. The point that I'm trying to relay is that we actually do get a lot of queries, from the global community that, when is the policy out? Is it almost finalized? What do you think is happening in the FAME too? So I think everybody's keeping a good watch on what exactly is happening in EV. To say that, there will be a four-wheeler mass adoption by whatever dates that, we have set, the government of India, I think that would take, a relatively longer. Like I said, again, two-wheeler, that's the sort of go ahead in terms of ease of applicability, ease of conversion, ease of adoption. I think that's the ready market. Charles was talking about, a couple of startups that have been doing wonderful work. So there are also queries in terms of, some of the firms or private funds, they want to directly invest in these startups, so they don't want to come and do a manufacturing setup. They're saying that, the good work is already there happening with Indian startups, why don't we fund them and sort of see the growth growing? That's second. And I think lastly, on the current EV set, there is also a sudden spike of interest in of course, in buses, and to even extend to capital goods. I mean, IKEA, we were discussing this example that they're trying to see that, whether they can do the last leg connectivity or transport of their furniture by using, emission-free vehicles. So that's a positive step. That creates a demand. And, when demand is there, obviously, smart people will get together and cater to that. So I think overall, it is positive. People are aware, both domestic and international, that it is the logical step forward. But it's just about, I think, couple of more months where more momentum will pick up. And I think personally, I think it's quite a positive trend right now, even with the given scenario.
Perfect. So Charles, could you expand on this and explain from an investor's perspective, where do we really see the EV market going in the near term?
Right. So where we've seen interesting companies. What I'd say back from a macro standpoint of the Indian economy and where we think is interesting, e-commerce is growing at 35% CAGR. You had industries that didn't exist a few years ago, like food delivery. So there's the last mile delivery leg has really exploded in India and didn't really exist a handful of years ago. And those areas are really perfect solutions for electric vehicles because they can go out all day in a tight radius and come back to a defined charging station. You can get high utilization rate in and out of tight corners. And the companies that we've seen looking for electric vehicles, Big Basket, Grofers, Flipkart, IKEA, Swiggy and Zomato are looking at some of these. These are companies that are looking at them not because of the environmental impact. It's a nice benefit. They're looking at them because they're higher reliable vehicles. They're more reliable, and you have per kilometer cost is less. And so I think the companies that are providing interesting solutions for the unique situation that India faces due to growth rate and infrastructure issues are really where we're looking at and looking at current investments. What happens in 5 years, I don't know. And as far as infrastructure goes, I've heard a lot of those issues, and it was something that you mentioned. Our personal thought, having spoken to some of the larger infrastructure players, be it BP or ABB or Delta, is that if there's the demand, there are large global players who will come in and build that infrastructure, but they don't know what to build now. What's the standard? What kind of plug does it look like? Where does it go? And so right now, the smaller companies are innovating and providing those solutions for themselves, and eventually, I think there will be a solution once the market is clear and people will be able to partner with them. And in my mind, that gets driven once again by high utilization fleet, and because they'll be able to come in and put larger charging infrastructure in certain areas that satisfy demand in urban areas. And I think that's the immediate solution. Otherwise, you're talking about the two-wheeler solution, et cetera. But I think that's still kind of the last mile delivery is where we think the economy is pulling, and that there are interesting solutions being provided.
Thank you. Vijay sir, again, you've spoken about policies. In terms of policies, what do you think what kind of policies, what should actually be incorporated in a policy really for EV players and investors to look forward to? And is there anything that's under the works for us to really, look forward again?
So first of all, sorry, Vijay is fine. There's no need for a sir. Yeah, that sounds awkward. Okay, so one thing is that we have talked about incentives, subsidies, but we also need to understand very clearly that we need to stop talking about prioritizing this segment versus that segment. I have a strong objection to the idea that, let's look at two-wheelers and three-wheelers now and talk about cars tomorrow. If you look at the numbers in India, we are talking about 2 crore two-wheelers sold, but we also talk about 30 lakh cars sold. And if you take the average price of a car and the average price of a bike, probably the value of the two markets would more or less be same, or maybe the car market would be larger in value terms. Yeah. The other thing is that if you talk about the development or investment in charging infrastructure, that may not happen if you focus on two-wheeler and three-wheelers. A car requires a charging station more than a two-wheeler or a three-wheeler does. Because the range anxiety for a car is more. The car requires a specific plug to charge. You probably you cannot. Of course, you can. The range anxiety on two-wheelers is less. Need for frequent charging is less. The two-wheeler can be charged at home by all means. So we need to also say that let's not prioritize. Let there be a policy which talks about equal focus, or good focus on all segments. We already have enough number of car companies, or probably all the car brands in India, to leverage that focus of the government on cars and invest electric cars and come out with some really good products. We also should realize that as the economy grows, people will eventually migrate from two-wheelers and three-wheelers, two-wheelers to four-wheelers. That is a never-ending market, and even the penetration of cars per 1,000 people in India indicates that there's a huge gap and a huge opportunity in the car market. If we keep that focus for some other day, we are losing a big opportunity, and for every electric car not sold, it's an ICE car sold. And the numbers are huge for us to ignore. So the pollution in Delhi is more because of cars, I believe, than because of two-wheelers. So how can we ignore cars? How can we always keep talking about two-wheelers and three-wheelers? How much of pollution because of two-wheelers? If we should have that data, and then accordingly we should prioritize. And if we talk about cars, then you also have a mix of SUVs, you have a mix of all kind of cars which are contributing heavily. So SUVs, there was some data point which talked about SUVs being one of the biggest polluters, the second largest polluters after a certain. So we need to have equal focus on two-wheelers, three-wheelers. We talk about two-wheelers, three-wheelers because we see them as low-hanging fruit. If you want a real revolution, a serious adoption, you have to think beyond low-hanging fruits. Every segment is important. Every industry is important. Passenger vehicle segment and the industry is contributing a lot to the Indian GDP, and we have to help them, we have to motivate them by policy measures to invest in those vehicles. And we should also encourage people to move as quickly as possible from an ICE car to a electric car. That focus is very much important. So I do not at all agree that let's talk about two-wheelers and three-wheelers now, we'll talk about cars some other day. That I'm not okay with, sorry.
Thank you. I think we've got a couple of minutes for, a few questions, so we'll open this up for, are there any questions? There's somebody there?
Mohan, I'm from Telangana Logistics. We are a B2B provider of logistics. I think one of the interesting things which Mr. Jaiswal said just now is about the focus. I think most of the discussion that I've seen happening over the last two panels has been more about cars and two-wheelers. But frankly speaking, I think the most polluting vehicles are the commercial vehicles, LCVs. And I think our focus somewhere hasn't really been on them with respect to what could we do about changing from a diesel straight to electric without moving into anything else. I think that would really have a maximum impact on the current EV economics as well. So I just want to understand, are there any governmental focus around it? Are the investors really interested in investing into startups which would like to invest in electric vehicles, in LCVs and HCVs? Just want to understand from a perspective of government as well as the investors.
So our state EV policy is totally in support of all categories. So our focus is not, prioritized. We are supporting all category of vehicles, including commercial vehicles. And the support goes on both the demand side and supply side, both on the passenger and freight category. So whatever incentives is available for electric bus is available for electric truck. Whatever support is available for a car manufacturing is available for truck manufacturing as well. Probably we cannot do beyond that as a state, So some FAME inclusion would have helped a lot. And if there can be electric bus be the buzz of the town, there can always be electric truck be the buzz of the town, because the electric bus is also expected to cover 300 kilometers per day to make business sense. And a truck would cover more or less the same distance in a half a day and then get charged and move on. So the kilometers required is very much there for a TCO advantage for commercial vehicles as it is for buses. So for sure, I think this exclusion of commercial vehicles freight category from FAME is something that needs to be looked into. From state side, we are all support for it.
If I can jump in there. So the companies that we've seen in the logistics space that are startups, it's obviously small because as a seed stage investor, we're not investing in large businesses. But you're starting with an L3, L5 chassis with designs and roadmap to move into a Tata Ace type vehicle. The L3, L5 has a lot of advantages around maneuverability. You can carry 500 kilos, and the customers that we're looking at are all, logistics providers, intercity, so big basket, udon, grofers, Flipkarts, etc. And I think there's a lot of desire there to have a larger vehicle, and it's really a mix, to be honest. They want a mix of vehicles, because you don't have one vehicle that fits all of your needs. It's not like you can have a UPS delivery van that you have in the US drive through all of our streets and do all of your packages. You need some two-wheeler, some three-wheeler, and some larger vehicles. So I have seen those plans, and what you're doing is developing the technology now, understanding what are the needs for thermal management in India. I mean, India has a very different thermal management problem than the West does, where you have cooler environments, and you also have different road conditions here that have different vibration requirements and water issues that you have in Mumbai and in Delhi that you don't have in other areas. And so you're innovating and seeing the smaller companies innovating and designing the vehicles that will helpfully be able to sustain those larger light commercial vehicles. At least I've seen the roadworks, and it's very interesting. And we're excited about where it can go.
So I think we can take one more because the counter is up. So
yeah. Hi, good morning. This is Rajiv, Head Electric Vehicles Business Gati, right? So I'm glad some of the names were mentioned, such as IKEA, Big Basket, Myntra, etc. But then the actual engine that is running behind them is Gati Logistics, right? Well, the question would be more to the investors community. While there are a lot many unicorns in the last mile delivery, whether it is in the recent past, whether it is delivery or Dunzo that we are talking about. but then there isn't any specific excitement or there isn't any specific investment that flew into the startups or the companies that are focusing on last mile delivery through EVs or through drones, right? Uh, are there anything that is inhibiting the investors community in jumping into this particular thing? Is it because of the policy imbalance that the government tends to move forward 10 steps ahead and then again gets back 3-4 steps behind whenever the auto lobby says that, hey, my sales are down because of your push through EV? Or you're still waiting for the market to get better or matured before investing into those last mile delivery solutions, especially through EVs?
Thanks. So I think, just on staying on point on the last mile connectivity. So I don't know if I did say, I mentioned that the investment community is very focused on pumping money into startups who are not predominantly into last mile connectivity, but they are sort of, like I said, manufacturing two-wheelers or getting into that sort of sphere. To your question, yes, I mean, it is logical, the investor community, and this is again, I've never had such a candid chat, to be honest, with investor, but the overall sense I do get is that they're sort of doing a wait and watch, and like I said, they're trying to see that let the market evolve a little more, because let's be realistic, I mean, somebody's putting money, it's not for charity. So I think there is the answer. I think it's not to do, less to do with the government policies or instabilities. That's not the feedback generally what we get. Like I said, on the counter, the investor community is more bothered that, when, like I was giving the example of the PMP, when cell manufacturing, when is it out? When is it finalized? We want to, grab our hands on that. So I think it's also the fact that the investor community would probably take an easier route, invest in a startup which is engaged into this, do like probably a Series B or C funding, make a return on that, rather than actually look for a startup who is in fact looking at EVs to do that last mile connectivity. The point I'm trying to mention is that, see, for example, Gati, you guys have a widespread, customer base. But if you have to actually account for your actual sales, which will come from this particular component, they'll be quite marginal in your overall revenue. So I think that is a logical thinking that the investor community thinks. I think it's not that they are shaky about what is happening in auto EV. See, we are going through an up or down, but everybody knows. I mean, cars are not gonna be, like non-existent creatures. We are gonna be driving in these 4-wheelers, 3-wheelers, 2-wheelers. They are the engines of our GDP. So I think it's just about a wait and watch scenario as of now.
Thank you. I think to summarize, investors are, doing a wait and watch. They're looking for proof of concept. They're looking at the commercial vehicle space more than the private vehicle space to grow this and see if there's scalability around this model. And from a policy perspective, I think the push has to be, standardized across all segments. And I think, if we can fill those gaps in the FAME policy to kind of motivate more EVs across the categories, it would be helpful. So I think Bhavna is already, waiting on the sidelines. So thank you, Charles, thank you, Nehal, thank you, Vijay.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, a huge, huge round of applause.